The soldier who fought in 3 armies. I normally don't watch these cartoons, but I am interested in the topic, so let's go.
Lauri Törni, the soldier of 3 armies. It was October 18th, 1965. The outdated South Vietnam Air Force H-34 helicopter hugged tightly to the mountainous terrain of the Phuoc Son district of Vietnam. As the French and Americans had found, this reliable but old workhorse was not well suited for frontline combat duty due to its slow speed and large silhouette. But maybe most significantly of all, its magnesium skin was prone to very intense and deadly fires if hit. Despite their best efforts, rescue teams could not locate the downed helicopter and its crew, or the Special Forces soldiers on board. It was not until over 30 years later that the crash site of the helicopter was found. It was concluded that the helicopter had crashed into the side of a mountain while flying nap of the earth.
You know, for the record, some good history here is helicopters really didn't come into effect till the latter part of the Korean War, which the Korean War was a total of 3 years. So you think about it for a second, we didn't really have helicopters in full force until Vietnam. And I think there's a lot of lessons learned. What do you guys think? And put it in the comments what your knowledge or historical perspective is on helicopters.
Among the remains retrieved at the site was that of an American officer who was the team leader of the mission. He was Captain Lauri Thorne, a U.S. military advisor who had also been in World War II, a commander in the German Waffen-SS, and a Finnish Army first lieutenant. He was a highly decorated soldier, and his awards included the German Iron Cross, 2nd class, an American Legion of Merit Medal, and the highest of Finnish awards, the Mannerheim Cross. Who was this man? Well, he wasn't originally an American, nor was his name Lauri Thorne. In fact, his real name was Lauri Törni, and he was born in Viipuri, Finland on May 28, 1919. Just 2 years before his birth, the Russian Empire had collapsed, allowing Finland to emerge as a new independent nation. Lauri's hometown found itself on the very...
You know who he is? He's the guy you want on your side. I'm not getting into the politics of the Finnish or that he was a German soldier, but from an American standpoint, he's definitely the guy I'd want fighting for me downstream. I don't want choir boys. I haven't even watched this video. I want warriors.
Border with the Soviet Union. And over the next 2 decades, the Soviet Union became more and more interested in annexing Finland. In 1938, Lauri joined the Finnish 4th Independent Jaeger Infantry Battalion at the age of 19. This wasn't an ordinary unit. It was a CC unit who were experts at sabotage and guerrilla warfare, as well as long-range reconnaissance. They were often considered an elite unit, and their job was to penetrate deep behind enemy lines, often gathering intelligence, operating from concealed positions. Sometimes...
Oh, wow, that sounds like ultimate Captain Obvious. Yes, they hid. Yes, they went to behind enemy lines. I mean, these kind of things are stupid.
Would carry out roadside ambushes, even being used to hunt down and destroy enemy special forces. He would soon need these skills, as just a year later in 1939, the Soviet Union carried out an unprovoked attack on Finland called the Winter War. Fighting in the Finnish Army. Lauri's battalion was based at Kivi.
Who else fought in the Finnish Army? Who else was called the White Death? So put that in the comments for some historic reference here. Very interesting stuff.
When the war started, tasked with protecting the strategically important Leningrad-Kitola railroad line. Once it was realized that the Red Army was pouring over the Finnish-Soviet border, Lauri's battalion redeployed and moved forward to defend the massive lake at Ladoga. The lake was the largest in Europe and had been shared by the Finnish and the Soviet Union since 1918 and had always been an area of high tension between the two nations. The Red Army attacked the area with overwhelming numbers, but they were ill-equipped, lacking adequate winter equipment. Their tanks were also still painted olive green, and their infantry were still wearing brown coats as their camouflage winter clothing had yet to arrive. Lauri's battalion pushed back and surrounded a large number of Red Army troops at Lemeti on the northern part of the lake. Both Lauri's battalion and the winter weather in the form of frostbite inflicted huge casualties on the Red Army divisions.
I don't think the Soviets were ill-equipped to handle the cold. Hell, half the country's freezing, but Obviously, we did the same thing in the first Gulf War. We show up with green utilities, green tanks. Not uncommon to be cheap in warfare.
Circled there. Lauri took command of the defense of Sugarloaf Hill, a hill that had to be held against the enemy forces in order to maintain Finnish reinforcements. The Finnish headquarters couldn't contact the defenders, so Lauri, using his skis, stealthily moved past the Soviet positions, re-establishing communications. Lauri then took command of a group of demoralized Swedish-speaking Finns, defending a key position, conveying orders through gestures, shouting, and punches because he didn't speak Swedish. Lauri's courageous performance during this engagement came to the attention of his commanding officers, and he was promoted to second lieutenant. But it was ultimately to no avail, for it was a short and bloody war, lasting just over 100 days. In the end, Finland was forced to concede 11% of its territory, but it was a hollow victory for the Soviet Union. They were thrown out of the League of Nations. Their casualties had been truly staggering, and many, including Adolf Hitler, now viewed the Soviet armed forces as a weak and ineffective force. In June 1941, Lauri went to train with the Waffen-SS in Austria for 7 weeks to gain further specialist skills, as by now Nazi Germany was a strong ally of Finland.
So obviously this guy did not have a love for the Soviets. So he's not going to go, in retrospect, on the Allies side because didn't like the Soviets. So that's why he went to work with the Germans, right?
Training, he wore a Waffen-SS uniform and was given the rank of Untersturmführer, or Junior Storm Leader. Ignorant of the political implications, his swearing of the oath of loyalty even after death would later haunt him in the years to come. Much to Lauri's distress, his hometown was now on the Soviet side of the border, as was the whole Lake Ladoga region he had fought so hard to protect. Even his barracks at Kiviniemi were all now in Soviet hands. On June 22, 1941, the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, the surprise attack on the Soviet Union. 3 days later, the Finnish attacked too, in what became known as the Continuation War. Lauri was back in Finland, put in charge of an armored unit consisting of captured Soviet tanks and armored cars. Finland would not take part in Germany's road to conquest, only advancing as far as its previous territories lost during the Winter War. On March 23, 1942, Lauri was skiing behind enemy lines when he skied over a friendly shrapnel mine while trying to capture enemy prisoners. He was hospitalized.
Now, how do you know that's a friendly shrapnel mine? I don't think the records are good enough to say, yeah, that's one of ours.
But eventually recovered, and instead of going on home leave, he went AWOL, back to the front. By this time, the conflict had fallen into static trench-style warfare, and Lauri's unit was tasked with counter-guerrilla and counter-reconnaissance against Soviet special units that were behind enemy lines. Later, this would move into aggressive actions as they infiltrated behind Soviet lines themselves.
I think this guy's got a misconception. There is no line drawn in the sand where you say, this is enemy lines, this is not enemy lines. Keep saying behind enemy lines. This is war. The line is where the last person stopped is your enemy, right?
On Red Army headquarters and communication sites. Lauri impressed his superiors, and in January 1943, he was given the chance by his senior officers to take command of a deep strike infantry unit that later became known as Detachment Törni. With the promise of better rations and more active combat during what had become trench warfare, he received countless keen volunteers. With a strict criteria for aggressiveness, physical stamina, and good marksmanship, he rejected those that were unfit and picked the best men. They would take part in sabotage, capturing prisoners, and intelligence gathering behind Soviet lines. In one mission, Lauri's unit used rowing boats to get into place. They ambushed a Soviet truck and obtained a bag of intel. Then, when a second truck came out of nowhere, moved into close combat using puko knives and axes. More Red Army troops reinforced the position, and Lauri's raiders escaped into the forest, stealthily sneaking past Soviet patrols, eventually making it back to the boats. Lauri had made sure that every man knew the enemy intel in case only one of them made it out alive. The unit would succeed in several hit-and-run skirmishes, operating from a base camp that was deep in Soviet territory. They also learned to use the enemy weapons, which created confusion during engagements and made ammo plentiful as they were operating deep in Red Army territory.
That can be a problem, right? So if you're fighting someone you used to, what an AK sounds like coming at you, if one of your buddies grabs an AK and starts cracking it off and you don't know where they're at, you could see how that's a problem. So I get his point about it confused people that he was using the other side's weapons.
Lauri and his men soon gained a formidable reputation for bravery and mayhem, to the extent that the Soviets put a bounty of 3 million Finnish marks on his head, as they feared him so much. By June 1944, the war was all but lost for the Finnish. Despite victory after victory against the Soviet Union, they were simply too outnumbered. For his outstanding bravery and leadership during the battle, Lauri was awarded the Mannerheim Cross on July 9, 1944. In September 1944, the Finnish brokered the best deal it could with the Soviet Union, and in effect, the war ended. Most of the Finnish army was demobilizing, including Lauri, who was by now a captain. So by November 1944, Lauri found himself a civilian, unemployed, and his country forced.
Question for my Nordic brothers. How do you feel about the Soviets? Whether you're from Finland, Sweden, or Norway. Curious how that feeling is today.
To a humiliating armistice. Once again, they had to concede territory and pay the Soviet Union reparation. As well as this, key members of the Finnish war were put on trial. Fighting in the German army. Lauri joined the Finnish resistance, who formed in the event that the Soviets tried to completely occupy Finland. He went to Germany for training in early 1945 with the intention of returning to train the resistance, but ended up joining the German army. He had secretly boarded a U-boat and had taken the alias of Lauri Lane to hide the fact that he was involving himself with the Germans. During his training, the German front in the east collapsed and the Red Army were on the borders of Germany. With no
I think what a lot of people have to remember here is he didn't have all the information. Now, I'm not making excuses for the guy. He didn't know what the Germans are doing. He was fighting against the Soviets. That was his primary goal here. So when you look back on this, I'm sure that's why the Americans took him, is he's not a Nazi doing horrific things. He just didn't like the Soviets. Put that in the comments what your opinion is there.
ships left, Lauri couldn't return to Finland, so he figured he could fight the Soviets by joining a ragtag band of Germans and was given the rank of a captain. Lauri used the same tactics that he had used so successfully against the Soviets in Finland. He was also joined by a fellow Finn, an officer named Somu Korpela. Soon he had gained a reputation for bravery, and his men loyally followed him, even though his grasp of the German language was poor. By March 1945, the German army was defeated. Lauri and his men were fighting for their lives and decided to head west while they still could. This was to avoid the terrible fate of falling into the hands of the Red Army. After VE Day, Lauri and his men found themselves behind German lines. Once again, Lauri performed a remarkable feat. He led his unit into Western Germany, and he surrendered with his men to the British at Lubeck.
Yeah, that was probably his best decision, surrender to the Brits versus surrendering to the Soviets. If you guys haven't seen that history, take a look at it. Good stuff.
Doing so, the Finn had saved himself and the men of his unit from years of captivity in Siberia. Lauri ended up being put in a prisoner of war camp in Lubeck, Germany. He feared that he would be turned over to the Soviets because of his role in the continuation war, or they would discover his involvement in the Waffen-SS. A few months later, in June 1945, he escaped the camp with Somu Korpela and made his way back to Finland. He was arrested, this time by the Finnish state police, but shortly escaped from them too. Lauri was then arrested again in June 1946 and tried for treason for joining the German army when Finland had signed a peace treaty with the Soviets. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison.
This guy can't catch a break. First, the Finns are fighting against the Soviets. Then they reach an agreement. Then he goes to prison for treason. Wow.
During his time in prison, he had made several escape attempts, which all ended in failure. His last one used a grappling hook made from bed sheets and scrap from the metal shop. He was finally pardoned by the Finnish president in December 1948 and released. Unhappy and disillusioned, Lauri went to Sweden in 1949.
Yeah, no kidding. You fight for your country. The country rolls over and makes a deal with the Russians. Then they throw you in prison for treason. I'd be leaving too. What do you guys think? Put that in the comments.
The false name of Elino Morsky. He ended up in Venezuela and in 1950 found work on a Swedish cargo ship, the MS Skagen. A few months later, when it was off the coast of Alabama, he jumped ship and swam ashore. He was reduced to doing carpentry and cleaning jobs, and in 1953, he was granted a residence visa.
Now, this guy is resilient. I can't think of one person that I've run across recently doing these videos that is this resilient. Unbelievable.
Fighting in the U.S. Army. In 1954, at the age of 35, he joined the U.S. Army, adopting the name Larry Thorne. Even though he was a recruit, his experience stood out vastly compared to the other men. His natural leadership abilities gained him rapid promotion, and he was made a first lieutenant in 1957 and then a captain in 1960. He had been stationed in West Germany from 1958 to 1962. During this time, he got in trouble when he got into a bar fight. A fellow Finnish officer pulled some strings and he got Larry transferred to the 10th Special Forces Group. He was able to use his experience to...
Can you imagine having a company commander like this kind of experience? Not your normal Delta Bravo history degree guy who's now a captain who hasn't done anything. This guy would be outstanding to work for.
Skiing, survival, mountaineering, and guerrilla tactics, and learned new skills himself in airborne school. In January 1962, Larry was sent to the Zagros Mountains of Iran in command of his team, where he successfully completed his mission to destroy the top-secret material on a crashed U.S. plane. Then, in 1963, he was sent to South Vietnam to assist in the formation of local CIDG units. In one particular vicious firefight at Dien Bien near the Cambodian border, he was awarded 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star for bravery.
Yeah, and back then they weren't handing out Bronze Stars to everybody. So that's a big difference. You see, today, there's a lot more Bronze Stars awarded recipients than there were back then, especially when you get back to World War II. So the climate's changed. So if you look at this guy, what he's done, it's pretty substantial.
Kong attacked his base in force and breached the outer perimeter, almost overrunning the area. If it wasn't for his determination, the base would have been lost. It is said that in Robin Moore's book, The Green Berets, Captain Steve Corney is based on Larry Thorne. When he returned to the United States, instead of retiring to a desk job, Larry volunteered for a second tour of duty. During his second tour of duty on October 18, 1965, Larry was put in command of a top-secret Special Forces unit called MACV-SOG, trying to locate Viet Cong turnaround points.
Yeah, look up SOG, see what their missions were. It's very interesting stuff, and you'll realize you didn't want to be on SOG because there was no capture. They weren't bringing you back if you got caught. Take a look at that. I'm going to do some videos on SOG here in the future.
Along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, when his helicopter crashed in the mountains and he was killed. His remains went undiscovered for over 30 years. Lauri earned the Distinguished Flying Cross and was promoted to Major posthumously. His name is honored on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., and in 2003, his remains were brought back to America. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia.
Wow, that must have been some kind of man to know. You guys know anybody like that or even kind of close? Put that in the comments. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. For my subscribers, I appreciate you. Thanks for watching.